Hi everyone, welcome to Bay to Table, Rethinking Tradition. I am one of your hosts today. My name is Martha Osterbiel. I'm the Community Engagement Manager at the Maryland Historical Society, and this is my partner, Margot Capera, the museum's Public Programs Manager.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us again today. We are utilizing Zoom webinars to offer today's program, and in an effort to run smoothly, we have turned off your audio and video capabilities. You are, however, still able to engage with us during the program by using the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. By clicking on the three dots above the text box, you can choose who to send your message to. So give it a try. Tell us what your first name is, where you're watching from today, and Martha and I will be checking out the chat box throughout the whole program.
We also want to encourage you to ask questions for our guests or Margot and myself at any time during today's program by clicking on the Q&A icon, also located at the bottom of your screen. A box will appear and you can type in your question. We're going to leave time at the end of our program for our panelists to answer a few of them.
And we also want to let you know that this program is being recorded and it will be made available for you to rewatch in the next few days. We communicate the release to you in a follow-up email and also through our social media outlets, and all of our videos, virtual, online, public programs are available on our Vimeo page. So let's get started. Many of you have probably read about how the seafood industry has been tremendously impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. But why? We are lucky to have a few experts join us and offer some perspective.
Leading today's conversation is Kate Livie. Kate is a professional Chesapeake educator, writer, and historian. An Eastern Shore native, Kate has been an active commentator on Bay culture, landscape, and environment for many years. She's written about the Bay's history, foodways, travel, and traditions for publications from Wood and Boat to the Chesapeake Bay Journal. Kate also serves as adjunct faculty at Washington College in Chestertown, where she teaches about the Bay's environment, economy, and heritage. Welcome, Kate. We're so happy to have you with us today.
Yay. Thank you. Kate. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, Maryland Historical Society, for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'm really excited to talk about the oyster industry in general with some of my favorite people. And I really think it's interesting. I mean, coronavirus has disrupted our lives, certainly as individuals, but of course the oyster industry was not immune, and it really impacted all aspects of the industry, but at the same time really sparked innovation, and in some cases has really changed permanently how we grow, buy, sell, and enjoy Chesapeake oysters. So our goal today is to explore all of these things from all the different sides of the industry, also exploring some of the historical context too. And so joining me today is my friend Scott Budden, partner at Orchard Point Oyster Co, Dylan Salmon, co-owner of Dylan's Oyster Cellar in Hamden, and Tim Wheeler, associate editor and senior writer at the Chesapeake Bay Journal. Thanks, guys, so much for being here with us. And I'd like to go ahead and get started once we have everybody video on and unmuted. You guys ready to talk? Talk oysters, our favorite topic of all time.
Sure. Thanks, Kate.
Okay. So I want to kind of work, knowing that a lot of the people that are watching today are consumers. You love oysters, you eat oysters. Maybe you're somebody who, loves to follow kind of changes in the industry. I want to go with what's most familiar to what's least familiar. So I want to start with Dylan. Dylan, talk to us about how the coronavirus impacted Dylan's oyster cellar. What changed for you during the shutdown and why?
Well, first I want to just start by saying thank you all for being here. Thanks for setting this up. It's a privilege to be a part of it. And moving to your question, it was I think as it was for everybody, it was a bit traumatic at first. quite traumatic at first. And as the outbreak was increasing in intensity and becoming, as the pandemic was becoming clear that it was going to really hit us hard, I remember that weekend we were busy. We were really busy, and there was this air of our guests of almost like before a snowstorm. Like a lot of people were out partying. They were having a good time. They were like, school's closed, work's off. There's like excitement in the air. But as business owner, and as I know I've sensed from a lot of my staff members, there's a lot of fear, a lot of worry about being exposed to such a high volume of people, and we're washing glassware by hand, washing plates by hand, being in very close proximity to one another, and strangers as well. So after that one weekend, it was like before Governor Hogan had shut down everything. We actually, that Sunday before, we were just like, we're closing for now to figure out what our strategy is going to be. And I was met with a lot of resistance from a lot of just different people that were like, oh, you shouldn't do that. You don't need to. Like, my dad's a doctor, and he's like, you're overreacting. But I really didn't feel like I was. So we closed for that Sunday, and Monday, Governor Hogan announced that restaurants were not going to be able to be open, which was a bit of a relief for me because it took some of the pressure off of me having to make the call for myself. But it was really a matter of me trying to protect my staff from being exposed to a deadly illness. And the weeks following were just heartbreak after heartbreak as I realized this was going to be a long-term thing. And I began to have to lay off staff members. I began writing letters to various figures in government, trying to figure out what the future was going to look like, if we were going to be able to get any financial help. And a quick decision we made was that I would do my best to keep on all of my chefs and my oyster shuckers, because those guys and gals are the bread and butter of our company. The oyster shuckers I've worked with for a long time, and you can't really find many oyster shuckers that are as good at their job as ours are. So it's very important for me to keep our oyster shuckers on, and we kind of just went from there.
So as it progressed, Dylan, did you end up did you serve oysters throughout the shutdown, or did you have to switch the menu?
When we first went into it, we went into carry out only, and we had a refrigerator full of fresh oysters, that we had just purchased that were sitting there. So I came up with the idea to bring in shuckers to shuck them all into containers to use for fried oyster sandwiches. And that was a hit. That went really well. And I mean, we're shucking like Prince Edward Island oysters that cost us $1 a pop, and frying them and putting them on a sandwich, which was not financially good, but it was a treat for sure. But we also started to do some to go on ice and clamshells, and that was met with mixed success. It's hard to serve a shucked oyster to go, and it's something we've done a lot of research on, and it's not ideal, to say the least. So we did do shucked oysters to go for a little bit, and then we kind of just put a stop on oyster purchasing altogether for a couple weeks.
So we've talked, I think that paints a good picture of individually what it would look like, from a restaurant's perspective. And how many, on average, how many oysters are you ordering a week?
Well, before pre-COVID, we were ordering, probably like 4,000, 4,500 in a week from various purveyors.
So with that in mind, that figure in mind, I want to jump over to Scott and talk a little bit about now, we can see the production side, now that we've looked at the consumption side, let's switch to the production side. Scott, how did the coronavirus impact your business, and how did you respond?
Thanks for the question, Kate, and thanks for everybody that's in the audience, the Zoom audience. And the organizers for this great event. I'm sorry if my background here is ghosting a little bit. I'll try to get it dialed in, move out of the range. Here we go. Okay. So that's a good question. Basically around the time, or actually at the time Dylan's referencing, I remember it very vividly because we had actually moved product to both the DC Mid-Atlantic area, or DC Baltimore metro area, as well as down to the Southeast United States through two of our distributors that we sell to, down to Atlanta. And from the Atlanta hub, they go out to places like Charleston, Savannah, stuff like that in the Southeast. And I distinctly remember, the announcement from Governor Hogan saying that inside dining and dining in general was going to have to stop for the time being, and wondering where our product that we had pulled fresh from the water, harvested to order, packed in coolers, and put on these refrigerated trucks, what was going to happen to that, because it hadn't actually reached the market yet. And the buyers, like people like restaurants like Dylan's Oyster Cellar, for example, other places that sell half-shell oysters and raw bars. So sure enough, we ended up having to take most of that product back. All of the stuff from Atlanta and the Southeast United States, fortunately it made its way back, and we were able to put it back in the water. I mean, a good thing about oysters versus, say, fish or finfish, other crustaceans, stuff like that. I mean, that stuff, you don't ship it live. Fortunately, with oysters, you ship it live. So at least, before they're shucked. And so we were actually able to put all of that product, for the most part, there was some loss, but put most all of it back in the water and, put it off to the side and let it basically, re-energize, feed, and get back to peak condition. And I don't think we've touched that stuff yet. We haven't had to, unfortunately, but that was kind of one small example of a crazy moment when basically everything came to a screeching halt. We had been harvesting since the fall of 2016 every week. We made at least one harvest a week, if not two harvests a week since then. And I think the only time we missed a harvest was January 2018 when the bay froze over. We actually got out one week. The ice was only 3 or 4 inches thick. We were able to actually go out and harvest oysters. And then the second week, even the tracks we made completely froze over. Couldn't get the boat out. It was like 10 inches or so thick. So that was the only week since we started doing this that we had to tell chefs and wholesalers, like, hey, sorry, we can't pull any oysters this week. It's just physically impossible. And then it broke up the following week, and we were actually able to break the ice again and get out and do it. So it was strange for us to not only have to put the stuff back in the water that had been purchased, but then see sales and demand go zero basically overnight, because the buyers, weren't able to be open in any real capacity. So that was odd, because we've been in this routine of every week, week in, week out, pulling oysters fresh, harvest to order, that kind of thing, and to go to nothing. So that was the beginning, and that obviously has, some morale and mental stress that's associated with it. But then on top of it, you've obviously got the cash flow implications and stuff. I mean, at the time with, how restaurants and wholesalers pay, it's not like they're paying COD usually. There's net terms of payments. So even if they were, they stopped, all orders stopped, but we still had some money coming in from, past due invoices and invoices that were still outstanding. But then, give it 2 weeks, give it 4 weeks, and now 3 months plus, you start to really see the impact of that on a, cash flow basis and how it affects your business. It's definitely been felt. And we've just had to adapt. So we moved very quickly to a direct-to-consumer retail model, something we hadn't done really much at all prior to. Like, we'll sell some oysters around the holidays to folks, Thanksgiving, Christmas, that kind of thing. But typically the demand we found has not been consistent enough to justify setting aside product exclusively for retail, and not selling it to the consistent buyers like restaurants and wholesalers. So we hadn't really tapped into that market. We always knew it was out there. And this was basically like, all right, you either got to do that or you got to stop your production side. And the oysters this year were taking off. I mean, they started growing early April, which compared to the last 2 years prior, 2019 and 2018, was, godsend. It was like, wow, we're actually going to get a full year of growth out of our farm. It's going to be 8-month growing season. This is great. that entails a lot of work, and you have to pretty much get on it right away. We had to bring stuff up from the bottom, and there's a lot of costs and labor associated with just getting stuff broken out from the overwinter mode. So this was all kind of happening. We were getting the farm ready for growth season. Growth was happening. At the same time, cash was grinding to a halt. So it's like you have to make some tough choices about how much seed you're going to buy, how much gear do you want to get. Because springtime is when, oyster farmers ramp up for that kind of stuff, and farmers in general. So, we had to have some strategic meetings and figure out where we wanted to be this year versus past years, trying to take advantage of the normal growing season, or quote unquote normal growing season, but in the midst of a situation where the timeline is pretty, still ongoing. I mean, but 3 months ago, definitely completely unknown. So, yeah, we pivoted, went to retail, figured out how to ship oysters cold, next day overnight through FedEx, through, most of the East Coast. We had been building a website in progress, Alosa Communications, shout out to them, building our website. And we were close, but this was definitely okay, we have to finish this thing up now and get a retail shop component finished, because we were doing it through text message and phone calls, and it's just not the most efficient or accurate way of doing it. So we decided let's put a big push on for the website. Got that done in a matter of a few weeks during the beginning of all this, and that's really been a big boon in terms of establishing that retail market. In the beginning, it was slow, and I think it was probably slow because word of mouth wasn't traveling too much, because when you're not interacting, you're not socializing with other people, it's hard to maybe get the word out there. But then got some good press. It really took off. And now it's kind of tailed off a little bit, but it's been steady the last few weeks. So, it's better than nothing. I think we're still, operating most weeks at a bit of a loss. But it's you either do that or you sacrifice quality on the farm. And we're starting to see the other side of this thing. We're well, we don't want to sacrifice quality on the farm. We don't want to lose animals. We don't want to make it so that when we come out of this, the product is subpar. So we've continued to work, probably extra hard on that front. And that's the decision we made to bleed a little bit now, so that it's going to be better on the other side for us in the farm.
So, Scott, what you're describing with this idea of pivoting, and I want to put this out to the group, how does this kind of represent a break with how the oyster industry has traditionally worked in the Chesapeake, whether you're, ordering from a restaurant or you're producing? Can you guys give a little snapshot for the people that are on the program about kind of how that supply chain has gone? Because Scott, you're referencing it and Dylan's referencing it, but I think showing, laying out the dots for people might be helpful.
If I could jump in, I think that it's important to look at the history of oystering in the Chesapeake for the duration of it. The majority of it in the history has been for shucked oyster meat. It has only been a pretty recent fad that oyster bars and places like my restaurant that have 8 to 10 different varieties of oyster on the ice every night for people to taste through. That's only been happening in the past decade, maybe 20 years tops. Typically, if they did have raw oysters, they were oysters, and if people asked where they came from, it was from the Chesapeake. And it's only been recent that you've been able to taste oysters from various pockets of the Chesapeake and be able to taste the nuances of flavors from, one from Scott's farm, for instance, versus one from, Assateague, Maryland, Seaside. And before that, Baltimore was a big hub of shucking houses where the oysters would be harvested. They'd be dredged up, wild caught oysters, and they'd be sold to shucking houses, which would shuck them and tin them and ship them across the country in that regard. So in some ways, what he's describing looks a little bit more like the tradition. But I think it's just such a new, it's so out of what we are used to. And out of what a lot of people have become used to of seeing an oyster, which is, this kind of smaller call, manicured shell served on the half shell.
Tim, how would you put this in context? How do you see this kind of reflecting the evolution of the oyster industry, what Scott's experiencing, kind of the market in general?
Yeah, well, and you know this well since you wrote History of the Oyster Industry. I'm a little older than Dylan, but not quite as old. There was a time in the 19th century when shucked oysters were common, and there were oyster booths on the street, and you could eat. It was the poor man's food. And right now, the price for an oyster makes it a little less than something you can plan on eating like popcorn. But it was common. But it certainly here in recent decades, the thrust of the industry, probably since World War II, has been largely on shucked meats and fried oysters, oyster stew, that sort of thing. The industry took a big hit in the 80s and 90s up until the early 2000s from disease. It had been sort of on a gradual decline since the 19th century. And in that process, lost a lot of infrastructure. I think that's where, the half shell market, places like Dylan's that have popped up that have given, more of a variety of choices for consumers has really come on in the last, 10, 20 years. And oyster aquaculture in Maryland has really come on in the last 10. So it was, oyster aquaculture was, again, it was a niche thing. There was a significant amount of it up until the industry took those major hits from diseases in the 80s and 90s. A lot of those oyster farms went away. Some of them stuck around. But then Maryland went on a push to create more oyster farming. They modeled it somewhat on what's happening in Virginia. Virginia has a major aquaculture industry. They supply more oysters, I think, than any other state in the East Coast. And we've seen a real growth here as well. Most of that sale is oyster farmers sort of have to be entrepreneurs as well as, smart aquaculturists, and that means that they wind up either going out and peddling their own brand to a restaurant or to a group of restaurants, or they sell it through a distributor. What happened with the coronavirus was that the distributors suddenly stopped buying because they were not able to sell to restaurants. And so that a big chunk of the market went away. I know I talked to a couple of growers who said, I was having some of the best sales that I've had in a long time just before the shutdown occurred. And suddenly you're left with all these oysters that what are you going to do to sell them? So this has sort of forced them to be even more market oriented, I guess, in terms of looking out for their own sales in the process.
I think it's important to mention that, and as you've touched on too, Tim, this idea that, Scott's business model is already really new. It's really only since 2009 with Martin O'Malley that there was a push to allow really and encourage oyster farming in the Maryland side of the Chesapeake, whereas the Virginia side had been farming for a much longer time period and could kind of pivot to the model that Scott's following now. But it means that, we're not looking at an industry, as sort of Dylan was talking about, we're not looking at an industry where you've got skipjacks and bug eyes going into packing houses and shucking everything into cans, where oysters are cheap, efficient protein. Oysters have become, sort of there's a connoisseurship of oysters that that really didn't exist even 20 years ago. You could maybe go into Clyde's in Baltimore or in DC and get, oysters that were shucked in the back and maybe had been shucked earlier that day, or, but they weren't shucked in front of you. They're not presented beautifully. You don't have a selection of, multiple. And so, we're really looking at a completely different market. Scott, with this idea that, you're a great example of how this new sort of entrepreneurial model can have somebody, building up their brand and their their name recognition, and singling themselves out by their oyster's flavor profile. How do you feel like that has benefited you as you've tried to do this direct to consumer? We don't historically have a model in the Chesapeake of people going to skipjacks and buying off the boat. It's always been this distribution model. You represent a break from that. So how did that help you or, assist you as you're trying to deal with the pandemic and this breakdown in distribution?
Good question. I think, Kate, at first it was probably a bit of I'd say, a hindrance, because when you don't have the traditional distribution network buying and it's not functioning, I mean, a lot of wholesalers and distributors, I think, had to make tough choices, and it took, they weren't looking to jump right to direct to consumer sales. I mean, they're built a certain way and they've got a lot of infrastructure invested to operate in that certain way, large cold packing rooms, places where they cut fish. And it wasn't like, all right, let's spend millions of dollars to pivot because we don't know how long this is really going to last. And so they weren't, as nimble maybe. And as businesses get larger and more complex, I mean, they tend to be less nimble. So up front, it was like, okay, they're not going to start buying from us to sell directly to consumers like that traditionally has been, or, traditionally in the fact that they're buying, but they weren't ready to, I think, make that investment or strategic change. So it fell upon kind of, farmers individually and individual brands to make that choice. And it's like, we were faced with that decision. It's like, let's give it a shot. I mean, it may not work out, especially as the warmer temps in the summer, increase. It's like, we have to figure out cold shipping. It's like, we know we can do this in the springtime. As it gets hotter out, it's like, all right, we have to make sure that these oysters are staying cold and arriving to the customer in a safe manner. So, it definitely was, I think, a hindrance at first, but then we kind of started viewing it as more of an opportunity because, when people go into raw bar, like say at Dylan's or some of these other places that have been mentioned, and, places that have come up more recently, they see names on the chalkboard, they see brands, they may try them, they may remember them. That's important to an oyster farmer because it's how you kind of get your name out there in the market. And, obviously, as people ask for your brand by name more and more, then you start to see restaurants order more, and your orders go up. Your sales volume goes up through distributors, through direct to chef sales, which we were doing as well, but not to direct to consumer. So it's like, all right, this could be an opportunity to really get that brand name out there in the market to consumers, so that they can start to associate our name, our brand with how the oysters look, how the oysters taste, exactly that unique flavor profile. And so if we viewed it kind of as an opportunity in that way, that when things start to reopen as they are now, maybe there is going to be some more brand recognition that we didn't actually have before. And maybe people will start asking for our oysters by name because they had a chance to get them shipped, cold to their door, or they ordered for a local pickup option, which we're also doing. So, it went from kind of like, oh crap, this is terrible, the worst thing for us, because we really had been ramping to scale our sales volume this spring and early summer. And when that demand went away, it's like, you're again, it's a lot of tough decisions, but we kind of viewed it as an opportunity too. So it was a hindrance, then became an opportunity, and now we're kind of hopefully going to see some benefits and reap some rewards from it as things start to reopen.
So with the direct-to-consumer model, beyond just, the logistics of it, which on your end were considerable, what potential roadblocks are there to selling direct-to-consumer? And this is just, anybody in the group can answer these questions. I can think of a few, but and the first thing, Tim's got a shucking knife on his side of the camera. And Dylan, you know this better than anybody. What's people's general comfort level with shucking at home? Do they come to you and are they sort of mystified? I mean, what do you think the public perception of this skill is?
I know that that's a great question, and we did early on. After a couple weeks of not selling oysters, I felt obligated and I felt terrible, like I needed to support our local oyster industry somehow. So we came up with a way, sort of like what Scott was mentioning, of selling direct to customers unshucked oysters. So I reached out to a oyster farm that I've worked with for a very long time that I knew was struggling, and I said, hey, can you guys bag up 25 bags of oysters? Instead of putting them 100 in a bag, can you put 25 in a bag? And we've been selling them every Friday for customers to come pick up, and they pick up a bag of 25 oysters with a little cup of cocktail sauce. And take them home to shuck them themselves, but that quickly presented the issue of who knows how to shuck an oyster these days. And it's surprising how few people do, even in this region, which, at one point I think was kind of a common knowledge, or maybe more common than it is now. So we started selling packages with shucking knife and as an optional add-on. And I started doing like a shucking school. I came up with a little pamphlet of how to shuck an oyster, which I illustrated. And we did shuck school on Instagram Live, I think, which was pretty fun. And people started getting used to it, which was really cool to see. People started posting videos of them shucking them at home. They started posting pictures of their shucked results, some better, some than others, and sometimes each week you'd see them improve too, which was really cool. Like 3 weeks, 4 weeks in, you'd see some really nice shucks and you'd be like, wow, they're getting the hang of it. And I can't lie. In a way, it was kind of, I was scared I was losing my secrets. I was like, in a way that like they can get these things for a lot cheaper than they do at my place and do it themselves. And there was a little bit of fear in that, but at the same point, that's just shenanigans. It was in the end very cool, very exciting to share this thing with somebody, and also to have them appreciate how hard it really is. So that was what I saw.
This is a tangent. Go ahead, Tim. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, he hit on a thing here. With oysters, they're in that shell. You got to get them out, right? I've got my knife. I've done a lot, but I'm way slower than those guys are. So if I want to eat a lot of oysters, it's going to take me forever to open them myself. I think the other challenge, especially when the shutdown first occurred, was so many businesses were closed. I think there was a general consumer lack of awareness. They just didn't know where to turn, didn't know that these would even be available. And so there was there had to be some outreach, some effort to spread the word. Social media helped a lot in that regard through, a lot of businesses and oyster growers like Scott and Dylan have presence on Facebook and maybe Twitter. I don't know. I've seen you on Facebook. And the industry associations have sort of pulled together too, and they have published, at least online, directories of businesses that are selling. Sometimes they were, listing specifically those that are selling direct to consumer. Other times they simply give you the whole rundown of places on a map, and you can look for the ones in your neighborhood and contact them and see if they're selling, carry out or will deliver.
As a Marylander, I think it's interesting that we are absolutely unafraid to eviscerate a crab with our bare hands. And we learned that skill from the time we're I can remember the feeling of my dad being like, you need to learn how to pick a crab now, Kate. I'm not picking crabs for you. So, the incentive is the crab meat. But with oysters, we view them as this, how do we get inside? It's, one of Scott's favorite recipes I know is to grill oysters. And that can be one of the easiest ways to get in there. But, I think it's interesting, as you pointed out, Tim, this and Dylan, this would have been a traditional skill that's really fallen by the wayside. It gets to this idea of oysters going from a cheap, efficient protein to kind of more of a luxury food. And when we think about access, that's been also, I think, part of the question that's come out of this coronavirus situation. Scott, I know that people have been asking you about kind of bigger oysters and the idea that, a bigger oyster might be a way for people to, to have, even if it's not cheap, it's maybe more, more of a meaty type product, to supplement, considering that we are seeing some meat production slow down. So, how has that, and I know you're trying to experiment with this idea of having bigger oysters. How does that play into this whole response to the pandemic?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's been a side effect, unintended side effect, I think, industry wide, where if your demand is falling off a cliff, which it has, but your production is the same, or in our case, ramping up, you end up having a larger supply of physically larger oysters. And, to echo everybody's points here, there was a time when oysters were viewed more as a commodity and the meat was the value as a protein. there wasn't as much maybe emphasis on the flavor profile or the aesthetic of the shell or the ease of shucking, because, shucking houses were doing the hard work for you. So as a result, we're like, well, we've got these large oysters laying around, or not laying around, but on the farm. And, what are we going to do with them? We can continue to let them get larger, but at some point they're going to be so large that it's going to be tough to do anything with them, even harvest them. So we did look into and are selling larger oysters now. It's kind of an interesting, I wouldn't say throwback, but we are moving oysters that are 4 inches plus under a different brand, a prime brand. And the idea is that, these are oysters that have been in the water and growing longer. Some of them are 2018s, but a lot of them are prior year classes, 2017, 2016, some even 2015 still. And these are big oysters with a lot of meat, really dense shells because they've had time to develop that shell. And, the primary idea is to, use these big guys or gals for cooking. And whether that be, grilling them, frying them, roasting them, baking them, broiling them, whatever. There's a million different ways to do it. And the idea is that when you do it, a lot of times with it, like a lot of proteins, when you heat them up, you get, the meat will actually shrink and not be as sustaining or, as plump and full. So if you start off with a bigger meat and larger protein, that reduction from cooking isn't as dramatic. The meat still fills out the shell quite a bit. So we have been moving on a decent amount of those under the Prime brand, and they're becoming more popular. And, in the beginning, we actually launched them when we realized we had enough of them to move right around the time when there was reports coming out about, failures in the industrial meat, supply chain and issues with people getting sick and meat processing plants. So it's like, okay, here's a way to maybe present a larger oyster to consumers, to have them view it more as like, this is a source of protein. When an oyster is 5-6 inches in length and pretty full, it doesn't take a whole lot of them to make a meal of, especially if you add toppings and play around with it. So, you can have a half dozen and actually be somewhat full, versus if you have a half dozen more the cocktail size, depending on your appetite, you may not be. So we viewed it as an opportunity again, like, hey, there's an issue with, chicken or beef in the supermarket. We have these large oysters that people can actually pick up from the farm. Let's see how it goes. And so far the response has been great. So we'll see. I think it's going to be probably a trend that sticks around a little longer than folks may think, just because hopefully people get more comfortable cooking and shucking at home the longer this thing goes on. And then there's going to be, I think, industry-wide, not just in Chesapeake, but all up and down the East Coast and on all 3 coasts, like a trend towards maybe having some availability of larger oysters. So it'll be interesting to see what consumers and chefs can do with it.
Dylan, from your perspective, I mean, I know that, at least in my experience, there's often a prejudice against bigger oysters just from a preference standpoint, from the consumer end. And I think some of that might be shaped by the prevalence of like things like Olympias or Kumamotos or little oysters that are available, that are cute. There's a cute factor. I mean, oysters aren't cute in general, so the fact that they're cute at all is kind of amazing. But I mean, do you see like there being potential for slinging 4-inch plus oysters at Dylan's?
Very much, and we've always. I personally love large oysters. I love tiny oysters too, but I totally see that that lean towards cocktail oysters, they call them. These dainty little things that you can eat with your pinkies up type of thing. And I think it's also, which has been great, because that introduces a whole new audience to oysters that otherwise would have been repelled. And in that regard, that has been great. But in the other regard, I think people are missing out on some of the experience when you get a really big oyster and it's plump and fresh and full of brine, and you like literally have to fill your cheeks to fit the whole thing in your mouth. And it's an overwhelming sensation in a good way. But you have to get your brain there first. You have to be prepared that this is going to be a mouthful, and you have to be able to enjoy it rather than be repulsed from it. And that takes time. And but I think it's very, very possible. Like, we've sold King Caesars. We've had them that are like, no joke, large, very large, 8-9-year-old oysters. We've gotten whenever we see them, we buy them. Like, we are into selling big oysters. We won't have multiple varieties of them on the ice, but we like to have a big oyster on the ice once in a while. And we see guests come in regularly that are like, oh, do you have any of those big ones? Sometimes, like my landlords, for instance, if we post that we have large oysters in, they'll come in and they'll buy 4 dozen each, like for their whole family. And because these guys are big oyster eaters and they like the big ones. So you do see certain guests that prefer it. And it makes me think about, this whole conversation makes me think about when we traveled to France, Irene and I, my wife and I, and did an oyster tour down the Atlantic coast in France from Paris down through Brittany, through Cancale. And the French are, very fond of oysters. And it's much more common for the French to buy oysters at a market and take them home and consume them that way. And we would drive down the coast and run into an oyster market that had, set up that day. We had no idea it was there. We'd just be driving through and it'd be like a market. We'd get out and it would literally be like a farmer's market we'd see here in the United States, but each stand had different oysters and nothing but oysters. And they were sold by the size. So the price would, the different sizes would dictate different prices. And the smaller ones were cheaper. They'd get to this kind of golden size that was the most expensive. And then they get bigger and they get cheaper again. But then the one I remember seeing, that was called the pied de cheval, which is a horse's foot. And they were huge, big flats, these French flat oysters, which are, I think I remember the price was like 12 euros for one of them, which is like, $12, or I think at the time it was closer to like $16 for one oyster, but it was monstrous. And I mean, talk about a taste sensation. But something like that, I think, would be a really cool thing to see come out of this, would be a bigger return from the consumers to welcome seeing something like an oyster stall at the farmer's market, to be a little bit less afraid of this oyster being this super delicate thing that needs to be cold at all times, and be like a little bit more aware, like Scott had mentioned earlier, that these are alive when they're shipped. It is ideal to keep them below 45 degrees, but they're not going to like kill you if they see the light of day, because they're sitting out in the water in the Chesapeake all day long. It's not below 45 degrees there. So, I would love to see this this apprehension around the oyster dissolve a little bit, and to embrace that these are a really nourishing food. And, the thing about the meat market, I hadn't really ever thought of that before, but, like how the beef production is terrible for the environment. Chicken production is gross in many ways, and how the oysters are a very sustainable, very healthy, very local and delicious protein alternative. I think that would be so cool to see that encouragement.
Well, I think, having also been to France and also had my mind blown by French oysters and their whole system, which is just amazing. I won't get into that. Could be its own like Zoom conference. I agree with you. And I think there's a comfort level and a perception that seems really different in Europe than the Chesapeake, with oysters in general. And I can't help but think that, we have a lot of old traditions that have kind of cemented in place here, at least from a public perception standpoint. The R month, historically, really, it's still important for the wild fishery. But for the farmed industry, which is growing now, really exploding in Maryland, and enormous in Virginia, there really isn't a limit, which is part of the reason. I mean, we're talking about size and we're talking about availability, 2 points of access. Farmed oysters can farm bigger oysters on purpose, whereas wild caught, you might catch a big oyster from time to time, but generally, as long as they're over 3.5 inches, they're sellable, they're going, so it's only if a lucky oyster gets missed that it gets 5 inches or above. So, big oysters are newer here, even though we talk about, and I wrote about, John Smith writing about the size of oysters being the size of my shoe, so there's this perception that oysters are all legal size or under. But I also think that, to the point that you're making too, Dylan, and Scott, I'd love to hear from you or Tim on this. There's a seasonality component and a sort of coming from the Chesapeake and what's the deal with that type of component that I'd love to hear you guys kind of talk about when we think about public perception.
There is I think a culinary tradition around eating oysters around holidays. So, and the watermen sort of all gear to that anyway. Their biggest time for harvesting oysters is up through Christmas. And traditionally, typically, by the beginning of the next year, the second half of the winter, they've harvested as many as they can get, and they don't, there isn't as much market for them. This past winter and fall, it was a little different. There was a concern that the oyster harvest was down, but turns out that they actually nearly doubled the harvest last season because there was a certain growth in abundance of the oysters. Now they did operate under a harvest restriction, but somehow they were able to actually harvest more. Part of it is a function of availability. They haven't always been available. Now with farming catching on, they're pretty much available year round. I know when I lived in Virginia, you could eat oysters into the summertime from the farms there. It's becoming more common here. But there is a real notion among just the average person that oysters are a big Thanksgiving treat. Oyster stew is a big wintertime thing to eat, and Christmas, oyster stuffing for turkeys and whatever are important too. So.
Yeah, that's something we definitely see a little bit in the farm market too, with more demand around the holidays. And I think at the end of the day, like many things, it boils down to culture, and specifically the culture we have here in the Chesapeake Bay, where we have have had a vibrant fishery for oysters, wild oysters over the centuries, and how that's kind of shifting a little bit. We have ups and downs in the wild fishery, and there's certainly bright spots and dark spots depending on, how the ambient environmental conditions really drive a lot of that, and the subsequent restrictions and regulations from the state. But with farming, it's kind of a bit of a cultural shift, and modern technology and food safety has allowed us to overcome some of those, scary bits, as Dylan was talking about, in terms of food safety. I mean, we are regulated by the state and the federal government to, in summertime, for example, have our oysters out of the water and on ice by, no later than early to mid-morning. That helps really cut down on the risk of any kind of foodborne pathogens that come from warmer water. Obviously the advent of modern refrigeration, we have ice makers now. We've got really advanced thermostats on walk-in coolers, and really good coolers, things that seem simple but weren't around not even 20, 25 years ago. So because of technology and because of the advent of the industry and its progression, I think it's causing a little bit of a cultural shift, maybe away from just eating oysters in the winter months and only eating them when the water's really cold around the holidays. I mean, I think it's kind of like maybe a coincidence that we celebrate some big holidays then, and it's really an ideal time to get wild oysters from the wild fishery. With farming, it's allowed us to have year-round sales, which is really important as a business to try to on a weekly basis sustain an operation and scale it, is to have that steady cash flow. And so if you were shut down for the majority of the year as a farmer and not being able to sell, that would be it'd be doable if you plan correctly, but it would be a lot less ideal and a lot more difficult, I think. And it probably would be a lot harder to scale as a farm if you were only working or selling rather in the months that are the traditional months. So we'll see as the culture continues to evolve, but I think it's already come a long way since 2009, 2010, with the advent of the modern aquaculture in the Maryland side of the bay.
So we've had a question here in the Q&A that I think it'd be fun to kind of toss out, which is the farmed oysters, are they more or less resistant to the diseases that affect native oyster. So Tim, you touched on this a little bit about the way that MSX and Dermo impacted the oyster industry, and really we saw the impact heavily in the 1980s and 90s, but really starting in the 50s and 60s. Tim, do you want to talk about how, the farmed oyster evolved and, how it is or is not more disease resistant than, a native Crassostrea virginica?
Well, there's, the aquaculture sort of came on, it came back in Virginia and it came on, or also came back in Maryland, in part in response to the disease wave that hit the wild population of oysters. And one of the big advances there was the development of a so-called triploid oyster, which was a genetically, manipulated oyster that would grow faster. Oysters typically, go through a period where they reproduce and they don't add meat and substance to their flesh as much. These oysters did not reproduce on their own, and so they were basically growing. Where an oyster, typically a wild oyster, would take 3 years to grow to market size. These could grow in as little as 2 or maybe even 1.5. So what happened was they were able to outgrow the disease in a lot of cases. The diseases that we're talking about are parasitic disease. They're not harmful to people. They kill the oyster, but they would basically kill the oyster just about the time it reached market size. So that was part of what was really knocking the industry back at that time. Since that time, there's been a sort of an increased resistance. It's been shown that that the farmed oysters can resist the disease and can outgrow it. And even the wild population, we've seen a real decline in the disease prevalence bay-wide. It's heavier down in the southern end of the bay where the water is saltier. So, the interesting test will be if we ever get another severe drought, whether we've really beat it for good, but it's at a pretty low ebb right now in terms of disease out there for the oysters.
Scott or Dylan, have you two experienced anybody sort of with any hangups about eating Chesapeake oysters because of some of the sort of save the bay messaging or the concerns about water quality, or like a confusion about sort of the impact that fish farming can have on the environment versus kind of not knowing what oysters can do? What do you see when has that been an impediment at all to how you talk about what you do?
I see sometimes guests will be like, how many of these oysters are farmed? And I try to take an opportunity a lot to educate the guests that, 95 to 99% of what we sell are farmed, because I believe in supporting that industry and allowing the wild oysters to stay as much as possible out in the wild doing their job as wild oysters, which is filtering water and building reefs and providing habitat for other species, they're keystone species. But trying to educate them that because they're farmed, it's totally different than a farmed finfish or something of that nature, which is having to be penned and water's having to be upwelled and they're having to be fed a specific diet, which, is a whole nother realm than farming an oyster, which is essentially kind of just placing it in its natural environment already and letting nature do the work. Although I'm sure Scott would disagree, it's still a lot of work to get them to grow. But the point is you're not having to feed them a specific diet, which has to come from the ocean somewhere else. And the farmed fish thing is a whole different thing. But definitely educating guests on the fact that aquaculture for oysters is, I think, a win-win for the environment and our economy.
Yeah, we definitely hear that. I don't know if doubt's the right word, but we hear people say, comments like, well, if it's coming from the bay and the bay is impaired environmentally or ecologically compared to what it used to be, how are oysters safe to eat? Like, I think the message that they're filter feeders has been driven home to the public and the masses in general. But maybe the biology and the specific anatomy of oysters and why they are safe to eat from the Chesapeake Bay, that message, hasn't resonated quite as much with or stuck quite as much with folks. And I think it's up to us as farmers, it's up to us as restaurateurs yours, as journalists and people who are covering this, to talk and educate via panels like this or just daily interactions. Because, people are assuming, like somewhat like Dylan saying with the finfish, they can accumulate and bioaccumulate heavy metals or toxins or pollutants. In the case of the oyster, they don't have any livers for that stuff to really build up. They are filter feeders and they're filtering the water, but they're eating phytoplankton and algae. We can't raise oysters in anywhere where there's too much human contamination, whether that's from sewage or heavy metals or pollutants, stuff like that. The Department of the Environment regulates us in that regard, and so they're out there every month taking water samples to make sure we're raising our oysters in very safe environments for the oyster and for the consumer. So it's something I think we still need to work on and still need to talk about. That yes, they're filtering the water, they're cleaning the bay, and it's making it a better place for other species. But they're not. At least to my knowledge, the science doesn't say that you have to worry about mercury or certain other things. I mean, as long as they're handled correctly, especially in the warmer months, I think scientists have told industry that it's a very sustainable protein and safe protein. So it's just a continuing dialogue, I think, to have with the public on that regard. So it is something we do here, all the time, Kate.
So, I mean, I think we've covered, everything from sort of the immediate coronavirus to this bigger picture scenario. Dylan, are you planning on opening your restaurant fully now that Hogan has kind of lifted the bar on that? And once you do, I mean, does the group kind of see this as, is there a long-term legacy that's sticking around because of coronavirus? Is this something where we're out of the woods, or are there more changes ahead? Anybody want to speak to that?
I mean, I could, my brain goes to a bunch of different places with that question. First of all, with the restaurant being back open, we are in no rush to get it back to opening at this point. I mean, obviously, we want to see it open again. I wish I could just snap my fingers and have it go back to where it was when it was a full bustling place, because I thrive off that. I love seeing that the guests come in and enjoy the experience, and that's where it is for me. It's in sharing food and watching people eat it, not like watching them eat it, but like experiencing it in all of its glory. Not seeing people, not bagging it up and putting it in a to-go container and they take it home and enjoy it there. But it's made me kind of realize that I think I would like to take a lesson from this whole experience and not to just snap my fingers and go back to the way it was. Because I think this is a big kind of, the world and, the powers that be kind of sending us a message to slow down a little bit and to rethink how we're operating. And I think a lot of restaurants are seeing this is to reimagine, what is a restaurant? What do we do? What does it look like in the future? And I think, what we've been talking about educating people on the quality of oysters, the availability of them as a local food product, the fact that they can shuck them at home, and being able to reimagine what the restaurant can look like. The big thing I'm afraid of is that we're going to rush to opening and we're going to see another shutdown. Or more importantly, that we're going to rush to opening and get somebody sick, not with food, but with a deadly virus, or possibly get a staff member sick, and so I'm in no rush to get back into dining at this point. But I am in a rush to continue to buy food from local farmers and sell it to the public and nourish families. That's what it's all about for me.
Scott, Tim?
I think, there's going to be a period here of diminished, demand or to go to restaurants, to eat indoors, at least until we get a vaccine, until it's clear that this virus is more under control. Folks of a certain vintage, maybe mine and older, or who have health issues already, are going to shy away from that. that's going to change, hopefully sometime next year, where we'll have a bit more comfort level about being in crowds. God, I miss going to the baseball game, for instance. Where's our baseball season? But those are sort of necessary sacrifices. One thing it's done is I've probably done more takeout than I have done in a long time, and tried to patronize neighborhood restaurants for takeout because I just want to see them survive, and also I get tired of my own cooking. So there's that, and I've got but I have bought gift certificates to several restaurants that are sit-down places for me, and I want to get back and use them, and I hope that they're still open when I get there. So, the good news is from the oyster industry standpoint is that things are starting to get produced again. The hatchery is cranking up. The Horn Point hatchery that supplies a lot of oysters for the aquaculture industry was sort of operating on one or two burners there for a while, until they could see that they were able to actually get out on the water and plant them and sell them to oyster growers. And so hopefully there'll be a demand there that, Scott, you and the other oyster farmers will be able to crank up your production and count on being able to sell it. So we'll try to have some more classes in oyster shucking in the meantime.
Absolutely. Kate, Dylan, Scott, and Tim, thank you guys so much for providing us with an insider's take on the oyster industry. I learned a lot. I think it's really fascinating to hear about the historical implications and hear about how quickly you guys are adapting your business models. And thanks to everyone who attended the program. We really hope you enjoyed it. If you love oysters, like I'm assuming most of us do, and you want to support the industry, please check out Dylan's Oyster Cellar. They're located in Hamden in Baltimore City, and also check out Orchard Point Oyster Company on Kent Island. I hope you'll all add learn to shuck an oyster to your list of hobbies that you're taking up in quarantine. I'm also would love to encourage you guys to check out Kate's book. It's called Chesapeake Oysters, the Bay's Foundation and Future. It discusses the history of the oyster industry and is a really great resource to learn more.
So thank you again, everyone. We'll be sending you a follow-up email with the recorded version of this program sometime next week. And also, Martha and I are going to compile a list of some local places that you can buy directly, that you can buy oysters directly to help out everyone. We are working hard to provide you with a new virtual program each week, and join us next Wednesday for our big virtual annual meeting with President and CEO Mark Letzer. We encourage you all to continue to check our website and social media for the latest in virtual programming from all of us here at the Maryland Historical Society. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all
Thanks,
so
guys.
much.
Appreciate your time.
Happy shucking.
Bye.